All right, Erling Kagge, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you.
So we had you on last year to talk about your book, Silence. You got a new book out called Walking, One Step at a Time. How is this book, Walking, a continuation of your thoughts in your book, Silence?
I think it very much is. I walked a few years ago. I walked alone to the South Pole for 50 days and nights under the midnight sun as the first in history with absolutely total silence. And somehow, silence is as abstract as walking is concrete. And it's very much about inner silence. So somehow walking and silence belong together.
Well, a lot of times people, when they're walking, they're not at the South Pole like you were. They're surrounded by traffic, dogs, neighbors. But do you still think there's a silence going on even when you're walking around in a busy city neighborhood?
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be. Somehow, I think in a noisy city or noisy daily life, you need to invent your own silence. You can't wait for silence to come to you. And I think by walking, it's so much easier to find this inner silence compared to like sitting down or, looking into a screen.
Well, one of the interesting things you start off talking about in the book with walking is that it can change our sense of time compared to when we drive or on a bus or a train or airplane. So what happens? What do you think happens when we walk? How does it slow down or speed up time?
Somehow time passes much more quickly when you increase your speed of travel. And it's somehow when you speed up if in a car, it's like time narrows in. And when you slow down, when you walk, it's like time is expanding.
And that's counterintuitive because we think, oh, well, if I can get someplace faster, I'll have more time to do the things I want to do. But that's not the case. I mean, in sort of lived experience, like phenomenology, right? You get there fast, but then you still feel like I have no time. Like that just went by so fast. But if you take a walk, it seems to prolong the experience.
Exactly. And I think, that's something everybody who walks, that's the experience everybody shares. That's kind of the great secret all walkers share. That time is prolonged when you walk. It's like a time machine. And of course, mathematically, what you said is true, that if you drive instead of walking, you save time. My experience somehow in real life is absolutely the opposite. When I speed up, I don't experience anything. Everything is in a rush. And when I eventually get to the place I want to go to, I don't have any memories. I didn't, nothing happened. But when I walk the same distance, I see things, I listen, I smell things. The environment is changing much more slowly, and it's enriching my life.
So walking can not only prolong your life because it helps your health, right? So it'll help you live to old age, but it can actually make you feel on a mental level, an emotional level that your life is longer.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, it's obviously if you walk a lot, you will live longer. You will have a more healthy life. Your heart will beat, in a better way. Your lungs works better. You sleep better at night. But that's only half the truth. And my kids, they kind of kept on asking me when they were small. I had three daughters. They kept on asking me, "Dad, why do we have to walk when it's so much faster to drive?" And that's a very good question. And I found it very difficult to come up with good answers to that question. And, I tried to tell them, all these health benefits, but of course that's only boring to kids. So, that's one of the reasons I sat down to write this book, to write about, what kind of wonders your feet can do to you. And, it's a kind of a little mystery because in each foot you have this 26 bones, 33 joints, so more than 100 tendons. And somehow those feet can become your best friends.
So you walked to the South Pole. It took you 50 days. Did it feel longer than 50 days? Did it feel like you were there for eternity? I mean,
yeah, this kind of strange feeling that you, on one way, you feel that you are there for eternity. And at the same time, you also feel that it's just this kind of tiny second of your whole life. So somehow time really doesn't matter. You're kind of beyond time when you walk to the South Pole. And that's not only when I walk to the South Pole, it's also, sometimes when I do a little bit outdoors here in Norway, and I think you can do it anywhere in the world, that, for a few minutes, hours, or maybe some days, you escape time, which is a beautiful, beautiful feeling.
So related to prolonging the sense that our life is longer, related to that is this idea that walking can deepen memories. And you mentioned a little bit of why you think that is. When you walk, you smell things, you see things, you hear things that you otherwise wouldn't smell, hear, or see when you're driving in a car.
Exactly. You have this, strange bond between slowness and memory, and between speed and forgetting. And I think, that's just when you walk in the street, I have a high pace and I have forgotten something, then I slow down to try to remember what I have forgotten. Or you're kind of wondering, if you're going to walk to the right or the left or straight ahead, then you also slow down to kind of focus. So, the higher the speed, somehow, the less intelligent you are in the present moment. And also, you're forgetting faster. And also think it comes down to feelings. Like when I try to walk away from a problem or forget the problem, I speed up to try to forget. But when I walk slowly, somehow I can digest those feelings and, go through those feelings.
I've had that same experience. It's hard for me to remember car rides with my kids, but I can remember walks that I took with them in my neighborhood or on some hiking trail quite vividly. And what we've been talking about really reminds me of research that says when you do novel things, time slows down because your brain pays more attention and takes more footage of what's going on around you. And that makes the memory seem longer because there's more footage to unspool later. So that would be the case when you take a walk. You're experiencing more stimuli that you wouldn't if you're in the seat of your same old car, just whizzing through the landscape.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's also about, what we just talked about also, to make your life feel longer. Because of course, if you always have a high speed, always doing the same things, driving, looking onto different screens on your PC or your telephone, you're into social media, checking the news all the time, then it will feel like life is short. And, I'm 56 years old, so I tend to go to these different birthdays, people turning 60 or 80 or 90 years old. And at least one will do a speech and talk about life being short and all these days, weeks and years, and he didn't really understand that was life. And I think it's a bit sad. And it's about missing this huge opportunity to live a rich life. And then again, as I said, if you sometimes walk, do different things, slow down, live a little bit more in the present, not thinking too much, because when you're thinking about the past or the future, then life feels long. And, life is long.
So in our last conversation about your book, Silence, you talked about this idea of injecting or putting in voluntary hardship into our lives. So let's do a refresher. Why do you think it's important that we do that? And then the follow-up question to that is, how can walking do that?
I'm talking as a Norwegian when I say, talk about the importance of making life more difficult than necessary. Obviously, if I had been born in poverty in Sudan, it would have been differently. Then life is already very difficult. But, if you're born in Norway or many places in the States, you really don't have to do anything in life, in the sense that, you hardly ever even have to get out of bed in the morning. And the mountaineer George Mallory, who tried to climb Mount Everest in the 1920s, he famously replied when he was asked, "Why do you want to climb Everest?" He famously replied, "Because it's there." And I think that's a very good answer, because I think, what he had in mind was that you really don't need to climb Everest. You don't really need to do anything in life. You can always choose the easiest option. And I quite often, have to choose between two things that you go for the easiest. But that's quite often a mistake, because then you also live like an unfree human being, because your life is so predestined that you always do the easiest part. And if you're going to live a free life, you need to possess time, and you need to choose the most difficult options in life. And when I look on my life, I think, it's almost all the great fun, all the excitement I have been doing, all great experiences in life, they have been due to me choosing the most difficult to the easiest option.
Right. So it's going back to that idea of memory and prolonging your sense of life. Doing hard things can add to that.
Exactly, because you can sit all day looking onto your phone, but you won't experience anything. You're not going to fulfill any of your potentials. If you do the opposite, make life a little bit more difficult to get up to do a walk. And of course, the walk is a little bit more difficult usually than to drive or sit down, but it's so much more enriching. It's not, do a little walk is not life changing, but there's always something which is happening. There's always something that is kind of adding to your life. And, so somehow I think, also try to tell my kids, if you have to choose between something which is, really easy and something which is more difficult, you should almost always try to choose the most difficult option. But, it's a struggle. So, quite often, I don't do it myself, but, I think it's important to keep in mind.
And you mentioned that idea, when you choose the easy way, when we do that, when we choose convenience, we think we're being masters of our fate. But you make this case, and other philosophers have also made this case, that when you choose convenience or ease, you actually are becoming kind of a slave unintentionally.
Yeah, I think, that's a very, valid point. Like many philosophers have been writing about this, and somehow, you need to choose if you're going to lead your own life or if you're going to be led by others. And I think, if you are, walking, for instance, making your own choices, sometimes, make life more difficult than necessary, walk a few kilometers extra, getting up early in the morning, then somehow, you lead your own life. You're in charge of your own life. And that's when, life will feel great. And I think the opposite, to choose this easiest option is very much about, in the long run, for instance, that you get, I'm not anti-technology or anti-capitalism, but if you kind of get absolutely addicted to different apps on your mobile phone, you might quite easily, feel restless, sad, lonely, and eventually, many people claim to be depressed from that kind of living. So, short term, that's the most tempting, but a little bit longer term, it's a big mistake.
Yeah, I think you mentioned WALL-E, the movie WALL-E.
Yeah.
It's an example of that. So yeah, like in the movie, the humans have to leave Earth because it got too polluted, but then they just become sort of this dependent on this technology where they just sit around in these chairs. And it got to the point where like they couldn't walk anymore. They couldn't do anything. Like they became slaves to the technology.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's the reason I mentioned this movie, WALL-E, is, one reason was because I saw it with my kids and it made an impression because, WALL-E is 800 years into the future. But, a little bit of what happens in the movie is happening with us today, that we walk less and less. And I think that's a mistake because we are walking species, and it's like Homo sapiens has always been walking, in the sense that it was not we, Homo sapiens, who invented the possibility to walk on two legs. It was the other way around. It was a possibility to walk on two legs that invented human beings. And we have always, been exploring by walking, by doing something physical, by experiencing. That's the basis of all our knowledge and, development of our brains. But today we are the first generation who starts to sit more and more, move less and less. And eventually, like in WALL-E, we hardly walk at all. The way we move, as I said, is by motorized vehicles. And then it's a question, will we still be Homo sapiens if we don't walk anymore?
And the statistics are pretty dismal. You highlight this fact that it was very stark. You compared the physical activity of children who are going to school to physical activity of people in prison. And people in prison, on average, get more physical activity than kids at school.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really surprised me when I did research to my book. I thought, I asked myself, what people in society spend the less time doing outdoors? And I thought, that would be people in prisons. And it was hard to find statistics, but in England, I found it. And it appeared that 1/4 of all kids at least about 40% of all kids in England, they spend less than 1 hour doing outdoors a day. And actually 1/4 of kids in England, they don't do any outdoors at all during an average day. So, it was a bit sad to see that it's kids that spend, doing the less time outside their homes in society. And, that's a very tough start on their lives. And, it's a very unfortunate start because, they're not going to be qualified for life, to have a great life later.
So you're a philosopher besides being an adventurer, and you like to walk, and you are part of a line of philosophers who also were walkers. So who are some of these other famous philosopher walkers that you've encountered in your reading?
It's surprisingly many philosophers who kind of kept on walking. Of course, Socrates, Kierkegaard, they were street philosophers. They just walked the streets in their cities, Athens or Copenhagen, to talk to people and see what was happening around them. And of course, Nietzsche famously said he could not, think any great ideas without, being walking. And it's also even reflected in our language, in the English language, just like in the Norwegian language, that like we say, you move and you're being moved, and motion, emotion. And if you go to Silicon Valley today, you'll see, people walk a lot. They have meetings and they're walking. And one of the reasons they're inspired by Steve Jobs, of course, because he was a keen walker, and he had this, and he told his kids, no way you're going to use too much products from Apple. You need to move around. You need to live a healthy life. And of course, the possibility for becoming a new Steve Jobs by walking is not great, but it helps a little bit.
I mean, what do you think the connection is between thinking and walking? Like, why do you think all those philosophers, like even Aristotle, he was a walker. Like his followers were called peripatetics. It's like, walking philosophers. Like, what do you think is going on there? The connection between walking and analytic thinking?
I think all walkers throughout, history, they have had the same experience in the sense that as soon as they get up on two legs and start to walk, their heads clear up. They're thinking more clearly. Ideas are coming to them. It's super good for their creativity. And fortunately, scientists have been started to study this phenomenon. And in 2014 at Stanford University in US, they tested people, in terms of creativity, like giving them things to do while sitting down, and giving them things to do after they have been walking for 50 minutes. And creativity, they increased 60% by only walking for 50 minutes. And of course, it doesn't last for days, but it lasts for a few hours. And then you need to do another walk. So like Darwin, when he was, working really hard, Charles Darwin, he had this walking path. So, whenever he kind of didn't manage to think any further, didn't manage to write, he got up, he walked his walking path, 10, 15 minutes, came back to his office, and then, his head was working again and he could do his work.
So I guess the takeaway there is if you have a big problem, a hard problem you're trying to solve, maybe instead of thinking harder about it, just go outside and take a walk.
Yeah. And, that's sometimes the beauty of walking, that, you don't even have to think about that problem. And that's also another, one of the big questions in the history of philosophy. Can you come up to answers to questions you haven't asked yourself? And Socrates was battling with this question. He felt it was a stupid question, but he didn't manage to come up with a good answer, because Socrates' idea was that we're thinking with our head, our brain only. But then, as all walkers have experienced, that you're not only thinking with your head, you're also thinking with your whole body, also thinking with your feet. And that's the reason why you don't have to be aware of what's going on in your mind, but you come back from a walk and suddenly you sit, with two solutions to problems you didn't even know you had.
Diogenes, the famous Cynic philosopher, he said, "It is solved by walking, solvitur ambulando."
Exactly. Beautiful quote.
It is. I got it hanging up on my wall in my bedroom. So another aspect of walking that you hit on in the book is getting lost. And we live in a world where it's almost impossible to get lost now thanks to GPS. Like there's always that blue dot on Google Maps that knows exactly where you're at. What happens when we can no longer get lost? What do you think happens when we can no longer get lost anymore?
I see the great advantages with Google Maps, but I also really dislike it. So I've taken it off my phone. And the same reasons, I think, one reason is because I saw this study that actually we have become less intelligent the last 10 years, thanks to, all these apps, because we don't do maths anymore, and we don't do navigation anymore, etc., etc., etc. So that's, slowly makes us dumber. And so that's one side of it, but also just not being able to get lost anymore. I think that's, I don't think it's good for anything. And I remember when I was a kid, I was hiking in the forests and I got lost all the time. And of course, it's a great experience not to know where you are. You get a little bit worried and you start to wonder and you really have to think, you have to be creative. It's healthy for you. And talking about it, I remember when I was maybe 7 years old and my brother Gunnar was 10 years old. And we were out hiking in the forest close to where we were living in Oslo. And we got a bit worried because we lost our way. And we tried to find our way back home. And then suddenly my brother said with a big smile, "Oh, I got lost here before. So now I know where we are."
No, I think that's a very profound idea that if you really want to know where you are in life, you have to get lost.
Exactly. And I think, that's also like, it's really a great experience to kind of start on zero again and take it from there. So I think that, that's a dimension in the daily life that we're losing because we have Google Maps. If you're wondering about something, we don't really need the knowledge or need to think too much because we believe we can find the answer in a second by Googling it. And that's very practical. But, it makes our life slightly more poor.
Do you purposely try to get lost when you take walks sometimes?
Yes, absolutely. I walk in the mountains and the forest, but also in the big cities. When I get to a new city, I like to walk the city. I like to see the city in slow motion. I like to see the city from a different angle than other people. Like two friends and myself, we walked through all of LA a few years ago, from eastern LA down Cesar Chavez Avenue into Sunset Boulevard, all the way to the ocean. And what's interesting was that everybody who travels in LA, tourists and Angelinos, they will sit in a car, they will see their city through the windows. And it's like, it's like seeing the city, on the screen, on a video, on a TV. But when we walked and we saw the same stuff, same matters, but, we saw it over a longer time. We saw the city in a totally new way. And sometimes, we got lost, other times not. But that's, that's the way to see LA, especially because, nobody else is walking. It's, more or less the only people who walked in LA were drug addicts or prostitutes or insane people. And that also gave it an extra interesting dimension.
Well, you said you got stopped by the police a few times who wanted to know what you were doing. They were like, "Why are you walking, you weirdo?"
Yeah. I actually read about, the police being a bit upset about people walking through particular areas in LA. And I thought, maybe it was kind of a joke, but way east in LA, we were actually stopped by the police and they were suspicious because we were walking. So it had to be something wrong, something strange, but as soon as, the police understood we were three Norwegians exploring their city, they asked us if we wanted, take photos together with them.
So you talk about in the book the idea that walking can serve as a way to transition from, in our day, going from work to home, or even it can, on a larger scale, might even help us transition from different parts of the year. How does that look in your life? How does walking serve as a transition point?
Today, it does it by, I live in a city and I work in a city. So I spend time walking, for instance, back and forth to my office. It takes about 35 minutes each way. And just by walking, I see sometimes, quite a lot of the same houses, quite a lot of the same people, the same streets every day. But I could tell by, the faces I see that they're changing, not a lot, a little bit every day. I can see, people who are happy, can see they're unhappy. I can see, how they feel if they're in a rush. And it's nothing kind of fantastic which is happening when you're walking to your office, but it's all these small details. It tells a big deal about daily life. It tells a big deal about the people you're actually living in the same city with, and also transforms you from, like, for me, having 3 kids at home. It's it's so much noise, so many things to do, and instead of rushing to the office, I walk. And then I, get into a different mood, and I get ready for a new life every morning to get to my office. And if I'd been driving, I would have saved some time, of course, on my watch, but I would have brought the daily life from my home into my office, which, would, make me much less effective at the office. I think, you actually need a little bit of time. You need to move slowly to get into a different rhythm and not different mood before you get to the office, if it's possible for you. But I think, again, people tell me all the time, I'm so busy, I don't have time, blah, blah, blah. But, reality is an average Norwegian today would spend around 4 hours doing social media every day. And we live in this country, probably like in the States, around 82, 83 years time. And that again means that we spend 13 years of our lives, day and night, doing social media. So when people tell me they're too busy, they don't have time for walking, they don't have time for that, they don't have time for silence, I think they are underestimating themselves.
So you mentioned when you walk, you see people, you can see they're happy if they're rushed, and you can tell a lot, not just by the way someone's face looks about what they're going through in life, but also just by the way someone walks in their life. You can tell a lot about a person, how they walk.
Yeah, I think that's, I found that very interesting, because of course, when you walked on the street, you see the faces for a few seconds, and that, can tell a little bit, but to me, it's too brief, too short. But when you look at people, how they walk, you can watch them for 10 seconds, half a minute, even several minutes if you walk the same direction. And that again, tell you a lot about what the people are, what kind of lives they're living. Like a guy the street where I live, he's an army officer, and the army officer, he walks in a particular way, kind of this confident, kind of full of self-confidence. He walks up the street. And when I get into the city, I see this, hipsters that have a different kind of gait. And then again, you see some beggars. And their daily lives are somehow inscribed into the bodies, and also inscribed into the way they've been walking. Like a beggar is somehow in the life of a beggar that kind of, inscribed in their gait. So you can, they don't get away from it. And so this, the way people walk is very much kind of based upon, their lives, their social status. And of course, it's with genes. So when I look at my daughters, when they were 1 or 2 years old, they learn how to walk. They still walk the same way.
No, I've noticed that when I read that section, I started thinking about how I recognize people. And one way, like if you're in a crowded area where it's hard to see faces, like at a park, for example, and I'm watching my kids or I'm trying to find my kids, instead of looking at faces, I look at the whole body of these kids to see how they're moving. I can spot my kid by the way they move their body.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, it can spot the kids, but also think it's kind of, interesting when you watch people walk, to guess, what are you thinking, what's going on in your mind. And, it's also, I read this report that the police, now, of course, they have depended on fingerprints in their investigation work for decades. But now they're starting to analyze how people work. And I think now walk. And I think, eventually that would be at least or maybe even more accurate than fingerprints to identify people.
And talking about this idea of how walking or the way we walk changes the way, depending on how we feel, you can always tell someone who's really tired from just life, right? So it could be a beggar, or it could be just someone who's really stressed out at work. But you said you notice that there's a difference between the tiredness of someone who's just world weary and the tiredness of someone who just got back from an invigorating hike. That there's a difference between those type of gaits.
It's a huge difference. And, when I walk in the streets and see people who are down, who are tired, it's a kind of a sadness quite often when you see them. Their life is tough. But then when you go, for instance, on a hike in the forest, it's interesting to see, maybe you could even see the same people, older people, when they start out on their hikes, they also look quite often a bit tired, a bit restless, not that happy. But I think almost everybody I see returning from a hike, they look happy. They are smiling. And I think that's just, as I said, that, you move and you are being moved. And Hippocrates, the father of the modern medicine for more than 2,000 years ago, of course, he said that walking is the best medicine, but he also said that if you're in a bad mood, go for a walk. And if you're still in a bad mood, go for another walk. And that's, that holds up, I think, for everybody, at least everybody I know about.
It is solved by walking.
It's solved by walking, okay. Exactly.
It's solved by walking. You talk about the story of Adam and Eve, and that the story of Adam and Eve is a story about walking. What can Adam and Eve teach us about walking and being human?
Quite a lot, I think. I remember when I went to children's school, I learned about Adam and Eve, how Adam was tempted by Eve, and how they were chased out of paradise as a dramatic story. But today I look at it, very differently. I think, everyday life in paradise, they lasted, one single very important thing, and that's excitement. They didn't have any excitement at all. Life was very, very boring. So of course it was tempting to, try an apple from the tree of wisdom as Adam did. So I think, they were fully aware of what they were doing. And I don't think they were chased out of paradise. I think they actually walked out of paradise voluntarily because they were fed up. In that way, of course, even Adam became the world's first wanderers, so the first explorers, by leaving paradise and, as I said earlier on, making their lives much more difficult than it had to be. And in that sense, I think Adam and Eve, they're kind of role models, because I think, I'm struggling with it, and I think most people I know, they're struggling with it, that, life quite often can be very unexciting, and you need to find excitement in your life. And then you actually have sometimes to leave what you're doing, walk away, and do something differently.
Right. Like Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit.
Yeah.
He had to take a walk. He had to walk out of the Shire.
Yeah.
To go on that and make life a little bit harder for himself. In this book, you mentioned this guy, I'm going to probably not get his name right because I think it's Norwegian, Arne Naes?
Yeah, your Norwegian is improving.
All right. It has improved since last time. Well, he has this idea, he created a formula for happiness.
Yeah, I think, Arne Næss was a leading Norwegian philosopher, and he made this formula for happiness. And, it's like happiness equals like, a big part of glow. And with glow, he thought about fervor or joy. But then you also need in life, you need pain. You need a little bit of bodily pain, and you need mental pain. So, it's a combination between glow that can be multiplied by itself or more on one side, and then pain on the other side. And I think that's something, which is very easy to forget in daily life, that you don't think that, you should only have pleasures, you should only have happiness, and talk to kids, but also grown-ups, and said that, all I want to be is to be happy. And then, then they forget that it's a meaning with pain. And it's not possible only to be happy. So, pain was given to us as human beings as a very important thing. And also important, it's all the way that you can actually feel happiness, is that somehow you relate it to pain in life.
So this goes back to your idea of, putting struggle into our lives. And, another philosopher, Peter Wessel-Zapf, he wrote a book on the tragic, and he said that, when you take shortcuts in life, you rob yourself of that happiness or just you rob yourself of an opportunity to be human when you take a shortcut.
I think so, because, it's, as I said early on, it's possible to make life, at least for most Norwegians and most Americans, it's possible to make life super simple, super easy throughout almost every day. But that, as Zapfe says, this other Norwegian philosopher says, then you're not living a life as a human being. You're living a very dull life. You're living a very unfree life, because it is obvious what you're going to choose, because you're only going to choose the easiest option. And, and a free man, he possesses time and he possesses choices, and he is key to fulfill his own potentials. And I think that's super important, because I think, in one way, all this talk about happiness, I think, happiness is a bit overrated, in the sense that people like to have happiness from minute to minute. And that's not possible. It's very naive. And yeah, I think, I don't enjoy freezing. I don't enjoy pain, but it's an important part of life. And a few weeks ago, I had this problem with my appendix. Actually, it ruptured. It was super painful. I had to go through surgery. I was staying in the hospital, and I was very down, and I got off to the hospital. And after a few days, I started to feel good again. I started to feel healthy again. And that's a great feeling, that you kind of, this disease, the weakness eventually leave your body, and then you feel strong again. And, and I think that's one of the best feelings ever. And if it hadn't been for the problems with my appendix, I wouldn't have had that problem. And of course, the same with freezing. It could be terrible. But then again, when eventually you get warm again, that's the best feeling.
And walking is a way you can add that, a little bit of hardship into your life on a regular basis.
I think it's important, actually, to walk from A to B, because it's practical, is good. But sometimes, I advise people, to the extent I can advise anyone, to, try to do some really long walks every now and then. Go on for hours, get really tired, wear yourself down. And not because it, gives some health benefits, but because it's a beautiful feeling. And eventually, at least that's my experience, when you get tired, you kind of stop thinking. You're just experiencing the whole situation. And then again, when you eventually make it back home, you can relax. It's a tremendous feeling. You maybe have a shower, you have something good to eat, and that food, of course, has never tasted better than it does after you have actually been on a long walk.
All right, so you can walk in the city, do it as frequently as you can. You recommend also taking a really long walk every now and then. Any other walks you recommend or that you've done, like walking at night or walking in bad weather, like just walk whenever?
Yeah, I think, it's quite, it's with my kids too, they say, no, we don't want to walk because it's raining. And, that again is a huge misunderstanding. And because, I think, quite often things looks more interesting and more beautiful when it rains. And also maybe you get a little bit wet, but when you eventually get into a house again, you get the beautiful feeling of drying up and getting the heat back. So I try to walk totally independent of the weather. And in a few weeks, I plan to walk with two friends, just walk Broadway in New York, from up north down to downtown Manhattan. Just walk it at nighttime. It's nothing big. It's free. It doesn't cost any money. I'm just doing it to see the city in the dark, see what's happening in the dark throughout the whole night. And so it's not an expedition. It's just about, about learning about other people. And of course, learning about myself.
One of the interesting arguments you make in the book is that the slowness of walking can actually be countercultural.
Absolutely. I think, Also because so much in our society is about speed. You have to hurry up all the time. Everybody says they're short on time. They have to go from A to B in high speed. They have to be on the phone all the time. They have to check the news 3 times every hour, although they know nothing has happened. You have this super restless attitude throughout the whole society. And of course, the government is very much about speed. They want you to speed up because you're going to create gross national product. Businesses would like you to speed up because they would like you not to consume. So either you should hurry up from A to B, or you should sit down and consume. And the educational system is also very much about speed because you're going to go through school the quickest possible to become a good taxpayer. All this is good, but, has good sides, but it also has, it's also kind of a little bit, negative to our daily lives. So in that sense, I think to walk today has become one of the most radical things you can do.
Yeah, it can make you free, right? So it's an act of rebellion in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's also, exactly, can make you free. Can also, it's even a little bit anarchistic in the sense that if you take the metro or drive a car, or take a plane, whatever, someone else is deciding your speed, deciding where you can stop, deciding what you can see, what you can do, etc. But if you walk, you do it in your own pace. You can stop whenever you like. You can, you can look around you. So in that sense, it's not a huge anarchistic thing, of course, but it's a tiny anarchistic movement to be walking.
Well, Erling, where can people go to learn more about the book and your work?
I think, it's when I wrote my book on walking, I tried to make it really short. I spent 1.5 years to write those few words because my idea was that, people could spend 1 evening, maybe 2, reading my book. And if they want to learn more, they shouldn't necessarily Google me or walking, but they should go out walking themselves and maybe find their own self-pulse.
I love it. Well, Erling Kagge, thanks so much time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
My guest was Erling Kagge. He is the author of the book Walking. It's available on Amazon.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/walking, where you can find links to resources where you delve deeper into this topic.